If you want to understand what a war in the Middle East can do to your finances, stop staring at the missiles for a moment and start staring at ownership. That is where the real story lives. Most people think an economic shock begins when the headline becomes frightening enough. Oil spikes, gas rises, food gets more expensive. Central bankers look nervous. Governments start promising relief. Families feel the squeeze. That is the visible part. It is not the deepest part. The deeper part is this. A crisis does not just raise prices. It reveals who owns the thing being repriced and who merely rents access to it. That is the difference between temporary discomfort and lasting vulnerability. And once you see it clearly, a lot of what looks like economic bad luck stops looking like luck at all. It starts looking like structure. I have spent most of my life studying capital incentives and the way human systems behave under pressure. What I have learned is that crises are honest. They strip away the flattering story. They remove the makeup. They reveal what was strong, what was leveraged, what was subsidized, what was merely performative, and what was quietly dependent on a world that no longer exists. That is why I never treat a geopolitical shock as just a news event. It is a stress test. And the first thing a stress test asks is not whether you feel informed. It asks what you own. Now, the source document you gave me begins exactly where it should begin. It says the Strait of Hormuz matters. The blockage matters. The price of oil and gas matters. And the inflationary consequences will travel through food, fertilizer, transport, and household budgets. It also stresses something the headlines rarely explain well enough. This is not just an energy story, it is an interest rate story, a government balance sheet story, and ultimately a wealth distribution story. Fay file a site, Fay turn 49, file 0 Fay, that is the real chain. And if you do not understand the chain, you will make one of two mistakes. Either you will panic and do nothing useful, or you will chase the visible winners after the move has already happened. Both mistakes are expensive. The better approach is harder. You have to understand how the system absorbs a shock like this and who gets protected when the absorption begins. So let me tell you what I think the real lesson is. The Iran economic shock, like every major resource shock, is not mainly teaching you how to predict war. It is teaching you the cost of entering a crisis without ownership. That is the mother line. Everything else hangs from it. Now let us go step by step. A war in or around Iran matters economically for one simple reason before all others. Flows. The modern economy likes to pretend geography became obsolete when we digitized enough things. It did not. Energy still moves through choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is one of them. If too much oil and gas must pass through a narrow passage and that passage becomes dangerous, then the market does not need a full stop to panic. It only needs credible risk. That is enough. Insurance costs rise. Shipping becomes harder. Buyers start hoarding. Importers start paying up. The futures market begins pricing tomorrow. access before tomorrow arrives. That is how a regional war becomes a global price event. And once energy moves, nothing else stays still for long. This is where many people still think too narrowly. They hear oil and think gasoline. That is childish economics. Oil is not just what goes into your car. It is freight, it is logistics, it is fertilizer, it is aviation, it is plastics, it is packaging, it is food transport, it is heating and cooling. It is embedded in almost everything the modern household touches without noticing. That is why an energy shock is not a sector event, it is a cost grid event. The entire economy begins repricing one invisible layer at a time. And poorer households feel it first because food and energy are not optional luxuries for them. They are a larger share of life itself. The source text says this directly and correctly. Energy and food absorb a much larger percentage of spending for poorer households than for rich households, which means the same oil shock that feels like inconvenience to the wealthy feels like attrition to everyone else. Fay file a site Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay. That single fact already tells you something morally and financially important. Inflation does not hit every class with equal force. Neither do wars. Now let us move to the second layer. Central banks. This is where the shock stops being only about what you pay at the pump and starts becoming about the whole financial structure. The file explains the key problem very well. Central banks had been moving toward lower rates in many places. Then energy spikes. Now inflation expectations rise. Now markets begin repricing the path of rates. Mortgage rates move, government borrowing costs move, refinancing assumptions move. The whole comfortable narrative about a smoother landing begins to wobble. Fay falecite, fay turn 49 file 0 fay. That is the trap. People think the energy crisis is about a higher bill. The bigger problem is that the higher bill interferes with the system's planned relief. If inflation reaccelerates through oil, central banks look trapped. They can hold high and crush more households. They can cut and risk looking unserious about inflation. They can try to split the difference and please nobody. That is not policy elegance. That is damage management. And once the market understands that the central bank is trapped, the shock migrates into every rate-sensitive part of the economy: housing, commercial real estate, credit, corporate refinancing, government debt service, long-duration growth valuations. Everything that depended quietly on easier money later begins to reprice. This is where I think most people still underestimate the problem. They imagine governments can always just write in and make the pain disappear. Maybe once, maybe twice, not forever. The file is especially strong on this point. Higher borrowing costs make it harder for governments to respond with generosity, because the response itself must be financed in an environment where financing is already getting uglier. In the UK example used in the source, 10-year borrowing costs jumped sharply, worsening a pre-existing budget constraint and making further support politically and financially harder. Fay falecite, fay turn 49 file 0 fay, that principle is much broader than the UK. It applies anywhere a government tries to solve real resource shortages with money while the cost of money itself is rising. That is what I want you to understand. You cannot permanently cure a shortage of resources by subsidizing the symptom and sending the bill to a balance sheet that is already overworked. You can delay the pain, you can move the pain, you can disguise the pain, but if there is less real energy going around, somebody will end up consuming less. That is the truth under the policy theater. And this is where the source document becomes more interesting than a typical war explainer. It argues that governments often respond to visible suffering in the simplest, most politically immediate way: subsidize energy, cap prices, reduce taxes, shield the public from the first-order pain. But in doing so, they often increase public debt, protect asset owners, and reinforce inequality while pretending to have solved the problem. Fay falecite, fay turn 49 file 0 fay, that is a very important insight, because the public often mistakes a price subsidy for protection. Sometimes it is temporary relief, but relief is not always the same thing as security. If the government absorbs the price difference, then someone still pays. The Treasury pays, the balance sheet pays, future taxpayers pay, borrowing rises, interest costs rise. The eventual adjustment still arrives, only through a different door. This is one of the defining economic mistakes of the modern West. We keep trying to eliminate visible pain today by transferring it into hidden financial fragility tomorrow that works until tomorrow arrives, and then suddenly the government is poorer. The rich have often been paid in full, and the average citizen is told there is no fiscal room left. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern. The file says the same thing in more explicitly political language, but the core is sound. Governments repeatedly spend their own strength to neutralize the first visible symptom of a crisis, while allowing the underlying ownership structure to keep rewarding the already wealthy. Fay falecite, fay turn 49 file 0 fay, that brings us to the deepest point in the whole story. Ownership, I want to say this as plainly as I can. If you do not own the thing being repriced, you experience the crisis as a buyer. If you do own it, or own claims on it broadly enough, you experience the crisis very differently. This is why the same event can feel like devastation to one household and windfall to another. And that is what the source document is really about underneath all its sharper political rhetoric. It says something morally uncomfortable and economically correct. The author entered the shock already owning oil and a broad set of assets because he was already rich and already positioned like a rich person. He did not need to predict the war perfectly. He simply lived inside a portfolio broad enough that when one real resource repriced violently, he benefited while ordinary people paid more. Fe felicite fe turn 49 file 0 fe, that is the harsh truth. The wealthiest people are often not protected because they are clairvoyant. They are protected because they already own enough of everything. When oil goes up, they own oil. When food goes up, they often own land, businesses, infrastructure, or funds linked to the system's pricing power. When inflation hits, they own assets rather than only wages. When governments intervene, they often own the instruments being backstopped. That is how modern wealth survives shocks. It is not magic. It is ownership breadth. Now, I am not telling an ordinary person to go borrow money and buy oil futures because a war started. That would be idiotic. The source file itself warns against that. The author says clearly that if you are not already rich and already broadly diversified, trying to jump into oil mid-crisis can be dangerous, especially if you would need borrowed money to do it. The lesson is not buy oil now. The lesson is that protection comes from broader ownership of resources over time, not from frantic reactive speculation after the move. Fe felicite fe turn 49 file 0 fe, that distinction is everything, because this is where ordinary viewers usually get hurt. They listen to a crisis video, identify the visible winner, and then try to become in 1 week the kind of owner they should have spent 10 years becoming. That is not how protection works. The rich are not safe because they make a brilliant trade every time. They are safer because their structure is already designed to absorb repricing. That is what ordinary people need to learn. Not how to guess every war, how to live less naked. Now let me widen this one step further. The source document makes a much bigger argument about government wealth and middle-class asset ownership. And I think the valuable part is not the slogan, but the structure beneath it. There was a period in the post-war era when governments owned more, households owned more, housing was more attainable, and ordinary workers had more direct or indirect claims on national wealth over time. In many Western countries, that public and middle class ownership base weakened while private concentrated wealth rose. The document argues that this shift leaves ordinary people more exposed to shocks in housing, energy, and food because they no longer have enough ownership insulation. Fe file site, Fe turn 49 file 0 Fe, that is not an abstract debate. It is the practical question of whether a crisis hits you only as a consumer or also as an owner. Do you own your home or only rent shelter from someone else? Balance sheet. Do you own diversified productive assets or only hope your wages stay ahead of prices? Does your society maintain enough public strength to buffer shocks intelligently, or has that capacity been hollowed out already? These are ownership questions, and ownership questions decide who suffers when resources reprice. This is why I have always preferred the language of claims over the language of sentiment. Who owns the asset? Who owns the land? Who owns the energy stream? Who owns the cash flow? Who owns the toll booth? Who owns the balance sheet that gets paid when the state intervenes? If you train yourself to think that way, the economy becomes much clearer. The public is often taught to think morally about prices: expensive, cheap, fair, unfair, helpful, harmful. Fine, those categories have their place. But capital thinks in claims, and claims decide outcomes. Now let us bring this back to the ordinary person asking the most important question: what do I do? Not theoretically. Now, the source file offers one explicit answer through politics and taxation. That is its own argument. But the more immediate financial lesson for an individual household is broader and more practical. Fe felicite Fe turn 49 file 0 Fe. If a real resource crisis punishes non-owners, then your job is to become less exposed to pure non-ownership over time. That begins with liquidity. Cash is not glamorous. Good. When war or inflation shocks hit, The person with no cash becomes a forced payer of whatever new price structure emerges. The person with cash can at least think. Thinking is one of the rarest luxuries in a crisis, so build more liquidity than the crowd thinks is necessary, not because cash will beat every asset forever, because cash buys time and decision quality. Next comes debt. A household carrying expensive consumer debt enters every inflation shock on the wrong side of compounding. You are not just paying more for energy and food, you are paying more while already owing yesterday. As consumption at rates that devour future freedom. That is why one of the best ways to prepare for macro volatility is not an exotic trade. It is reducing stupid debt. Not all debt. Stupid debt. Debt that financed lifestyle performance rather than productive ownership. Then comes ownership itself. And here you must think like an adult, not like a gambler. You do not need to own every commodity directly. You do need to move your life over time from pure wage dependence toward broader claims on productive assets, broad equity funds, retirement accounts actually funded, a sane path to home ownership if the numbers work and your life circumstances support it. Ownership in a real business, a cash-flowing side asset, a skills stack that increases your bargaining power. The exact vehicle will vary, the principle will not. The less your life depends solely on wages and government mercy, the more resilient you become. That is the core lesson of every resource shock. Then there is energy dependence itself. The source text criticizes governments for subsidizing all consumption indiscriminately rather than reducing the most wasteful forms of energy use. Behind the politics is a useful household principle. When a resource becomes scarce, the first protection is not only financial, it is also behavioral. Reduce unnecessary dependence before the market forces you to do it, at worst terms. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn 49, File 0 Fay. That means looking honestly at commuting patterns, heating and cooling habits, energy waste, transport assumptions, and whether your household is designed around fragile inputs. This is not romantic minimalism, it is systems thinking. A household with lower burn rate is stronger than a household with a prettier script. That has always been true. Crises merely make it visible. Now let me say something about media and fear, because the end of the source file does this well. The author becomes very explicit that the constant stream of war headlines is destabilizing by design, and that people need the skill of remaining calm amid outrageous news. That is good advice. And it matters more than people think. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn 49, File 0, Fay. A frightened household does not make good capital decisions. It reacts, it chases, it doom scrolls, it tries to turn stress into action simply because the stress itself feels intolerable. That is how people buy the top of oil, sell the bottom of quality assets, and let headlines dictate their structure. If you want to protect yourself in a crisis, protect your mind first, not by becoming uninformed, by becoming less manipulable. Read enough to understand the chain. Do not marinate in theater. The market does not pay you for emotional participation. It pays you for correct positioning. That is a very different thing. Now, I want to tell you what I think the deeper long-term answer is, and it is not exciting. The long-term answer to resource shocks is not becoming a better crisis watcher. It is becoming a sturdier owner. That means fewer liabilities built for applause, more reserves, more productive assets, more room, more patience, more distance between your identity and your consumption. More willingness to look boring while you build actual insulation. This is where ordinary people often go wrong. They think the rich are safe because the rich know more. Sometimes they do. Often they are simply less exposed. That is a huge difference. A broad owner does not have to predict perfectly. He just has to avoid being structurally naked. That is a much more reachable standard for ordinary households than the fantasy of becoming some macro genius who trades every war correctly. Do not worship prediction. Worship preparation. That is the adult version of financial intelligence. Now let me be honest about politics for one brief moment, because the source file places great weight on tax and redistribution as the only real answer. Fay file a cite, Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay, whether one agrees with every policy conclusion or not. The economic insight behind it is valid. If ownership keeps concentrating and households keep losing direct or indirect claims on housing, energy, and national wealth, then every future shock will hit ordinary people harder. You can call the remedy many things: tax reform, asset democratization, public wealth restoration, broader ownership policy, retirement expansion, housing reform. What matters is the principle. A society where most people own too little of what matters becomes a society where every crisis redistributes upward. That is not ideology, that is mechanics. And the individual version of that same truth is just as stark. If you own too little, every repricing becomes a tax on your life. That is why I keep returning to ownership. Not because it sounds elegant, because it explains almost everything. Now, let me finish with the one sentence I think matters most. The Iran economic shock is coming for consumers first and owners second. That is the order. If you are only a consumer of energy, housing, food, and money, then you absorb the shock through higher prices and less flexibility. If you are also an owner of broad productive assets, then the same shock may still hurt, but it does not hit you from only one side. That is what people with real portfolios understand. They do not merely fear repricing, they live on both sides of it. That is why they survive better. So here is the final choice. You can keep treating crises like this as headline events to be emotionally endured, waiting for governments, experts, and central banks to somehow rescue your standard of living after the repricing has already begun. That is what most people will do. Or you can do the harder thing. You can build cash, reduce stupid debt, lower unnecessary resource dependence, accumulate broader ownership, strengthen your mind against theatrical fear, and gradually move your life from the side of pure consumption toward the side of claims. That is how you protect yourself. Not by guessing every missile, by refusing to stay structurally naked in a world where real resources keep getting repriced and governments keep discovering too late that subsidies are not the same thing as strength. Own more, owe less, need less, think better. That is the protection, and it matters long before the next war ever begins.